Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm honored to be here today. Welcome to this session, which is the Haudenosaunee and the story of the Peacemaker, but really I think it's better titled as a Haudenosaunee approach to peace. So I'm honored and humbled to be here with you today, this afternoon. So thanks for coming along and joining. So before we get started, Sego Gwego, Ronalyn Pollack Yungyuts, Mississauga, the New Credit First Nation, Six Nations of the Grand River, Nide Wagenun, Ganya Geha, Anishinaabe, Aquaxnawagi Delota. I said, hello, everyone. My name is Ronalyn, or Ronalyn Pollack. I am of the Mississauga of the Credit and Six Nations of the Grand River, and I am Mohawk and Anishinaabe. And being Anishinaabe with the Mississaugas, we are Eagle Clan. So again, I am so happy to be here with you today. Can everyone see me? Maybe just give a thumbs up if you can hear me okay. All right, awesome. All right, so just checking one last thing. Okay, all right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So again, thank you so much for being here with me today. I also am I'm executive director of the Native American Cultural Center here in Rochester. And I mean, so it's largely why I'm coming to you today with that. I adjunct to MCC in the Health and Phys Ed department. I have done that for a number of years. So while I did not grow up with my culture, I'm honored still to be here with you today talking about the story of the Peacemaker. And while I didn't grow up with my culture, I know that my culture has always resided within me. And I'll explain some of the reason why I didn't grow up with my culture. My grandmother, she was a survivor, I call her a thriver, of residential school. For those of you that are unfamiliar with residential school, I encourage you to look it up in further depth, after the end of the summit today. But I'll encapsulate it really quickly. Residential school, it basically was the US government and also the Canadian government that were in cahoots largely with the Catholic Church here in the United States and the Anglican Church in Canada. And they were in cahoots together, and they had gone to reservations and took children away from their families. And the whole supposed purpose behind this was assimilation, which is a nice way of saying cultural genocide. So unfortunately, when these children were brought to residential school, they were stripped of not just their culture, but their identity of who they were as a Native American. So they were stripped of their clothes. They were given very militaristic clothes and militaristic haircuts and glasses if they wore them, all of that. But largely, they were also stripped of their language. They couldn't speak their language. They were actually punished if they spoke their language. Didn't have any of their regalia, and largely, were absent from their families and their culture and their community. So they were stripped away from the blessing of having their teachings. So that's, a large reason why I didn't have my culture growing up, because then when my grandmother, when, she married and had children, she wasn't able to pass that. Some 5 sisters, they didn't grow up with their culture either. So it was something that they couldn't pass down to their children. So that's largely why I didn't grow up with my culture. But like I said, largely I know my culture had always resided within me. And as an adult too, I've taken it upon myself to become familiar with and to know my culture. Not only for my benefit, but largely for the benefit of my children as well, too. It was something that I wanted to be able to pass on to them. And to me, as I've embraced my culture and I've, been very purposeful in understanding and learning my culture as an adult, I feel it's also a way to honor my grandmother and my mother, because they were denied their cultural teachings. Largely, because my grandmother was an unfortunate attendee of residential school. Just a quick reminder, if you're not muted, if you could go ahead and mute yourself while we're in this session, so we can, there's no feedback, all of interference, in that regard. So anyway, I feel like it's a way to honor my grandmother and my mother. So when I come to you today, you know, like I said, I didn't grow up with my culture. So in coming to you today, you know, I don't certainly think it of myself or take it upon myself to be one that is, you know, equatable to a knowledge keeper, you know, or having all the wisdom and the knowledge of an elder. You know, like I said, it was something I really didn't step into until my adulthood. So I come to you very humbly, just knowing what I know. And I'll also share with you a very personal story that shows the parallel that in my life, even though I didn't grow up with my culture, you know, it certainly was always there residing within me. So as an adult, you know, when I've learned and, you know, I've sat under some of the teachings of our elders, and learned the story of the peacemaker, you know, I realized that in my life, again, having said, I'm sorry, I keep repeating myself, but, you know, knowing that my culture resided within me. And when I learned the stories of, or heard the stories of the peacemaker, I realized too, that there were times in my life where I chose certain paths. And in choosing these certain paths, they actually paralleled in many aspects with my cultural teachings, unbeknownst to me at the time in my life. So in that same thread, I have been on a forgiveness journey for many years. I'm happy to be on this forgiveness journey. I fully embrace all that forgiveness encompasses. And I'm very grateful for that. And, you know, while I can, you know, turn the stories and turn my journey on this path of forgiveness into great stories to share with you all, it comes with incredible hardship. You know, you don't get to experience and fully understand and emulate, you know, what forgiveness is without having gone through some struggles and without having gone through some difficult situations in life. So I'm grateful for them because they've brought me to this path, and I'm grateful for them because it's really helped mold and shape who I am. One other thing too, I also wanted to make mention of, you know, it was important for me to embrace my culture as an adult, like I said, because it was something I wanted to pass on to my children, and so my children can pass on to their children. Because as a Haudenosaunee, and as, I mean, there are many Native American nations that believe in a 7 generations concept and a 7 generations teaching. So it means that whatever decisions we're making for today, it's not just about today. So in other words, when we're making decisions, they're not selfish decisions. It's not just about us, but it's about, okay, the decisions I'm making today, how is this going to impact for the next 7 generations to come? So that's a large reason too, you know, of embracing my culture and being able to pass that on. So nonetheless, you know, being on this forgiveness path and being on this forgiveness journey, you know, is something that I fully embraced. And when I began, like I said, to learn the teachings of the peacemaker, I realized, like, unbeknownst to me, you know, some of the parallels, but that's where I can identify with my culture always residing within me. You know, our DNA has structural memory. So it was like those aspects, you know, we're finally intersecting and we're finally coming to life. So the story of the peacemaker, and largely we're an oral culture, you know, so our culture and our traditions are passed down orally. So as I begin to tell you the story of the peacemaker, you know, time is really not known. You know, there's really no structure as to definitively, yes, the peacemaker came during this time. I mean, it could have been 2,000 years ago. It could have been 1,000 years ago. But needless to say, it was a time when there was much war and much strife going on amongst our people. And not only amongst the 5 nations at the time, but there was also incredible strife and incredible warring happening within our families as well, too. So it wasn't just nation against nation, it was also brother against brother. So there was much bloodshed, many atrocities that were taking place and being carried out amongst the 5 nations, but also on a more intimate level, you know, brother to brother. So Creator saw this and saw that it was not good, and so he sent a peacemaker. The peacemaker was a Huron, and he came across the lake and landed actually what is the southern shores of Lake Ontario. And From the many variations of the story of the Peacemaker that I've heard, it's largely within the Seneca territory, which is the territory in which Rochester, New York encompasses. So for those of you, right, because this is the Rochester Summer to End Hate, for those of you that are joining from Rochester, you may be familiar, obviously, with the southern shores of Ontario. So what I've heard, his landing could have been anywhere, where Durand Beach is, to anywhere where, Seabreeze area is as well, too. So anywhere within that vicinity. And so when he came with a significant message, and this message was of peace and unity. And when he landed, he came upon a Seneca woman named Jugunsase, and she was actually the first to accept his message of peace and to fully embrace it. I want to also put another disclaimer, like I'm taking this huge story and encapsulating it into a very small time frame. So I'm skipping over many, significant details, but nonetheless, trying to bring you the best I can in the story of the Peacemaker and a Haudenosaunee approach to peace that I can within this time frame. So let's see. So he met Jugunsase, and she fully embraced and accepted his message of peace, which was of unity. And I feel like, you really can't talk about unity and peace without talking about reconciliation or forgiveness. So I feel like that was largely a message that he embraced as well, too. Which, yes, certainly was peace and unity, but largely, that reconciliation and the forgiveness. So then he had traveled to the Mohawks to bring them the message of peace. And geographically, the Mohawks, we refer to as the keepers of the Eastern Door. And so geographically speaking, if you can visualize New York State, the Mohawk Valley, that was the territory of the Mohawks. So when the Peacemaker landed here, met Jugunsase, and I then traveled to the Mohawks, letting them know that he had a message of peace to bring to them, and it was actually him that they were waiting for. But the Mohawks, they were kind of unsure whether or not they could trust him, if in fact he was this person, that they were expecting that would bring this message of peace. And if indeed he had a message so important and so powerful, then certainly he could prove this through a certain measure, if you will. So the Mohawks had asked the Peacemaker to climb a tree that was over this falls area, which from variations I've heard is Cohoes Falls, and Cohoes Falls is within that Mohawk Valley. And so he climbed the tree and went over the falls, and surely if he indeed was who he was saying he was, he would be able to survive that, and then, could come to the Mohawks and bring that message of peace. So he climbed the tree, went over the falls, the Mohawks waited, and they didn't see him, and they didn't find him. So they returned back to their village, and again, there's different variations of how I understand this. I've heard that it was when they returned back to their village, or the next morning, they found the Peacemaker actually sitting by a campfire just outside of the village. And so needless to say, when they saw him sitting there, they knew that he said who he said he was and the message that he had to bring to them. So in meeting with the Mohawks, and these being the first peoples and the first nation that he was bringing this message of peace to, there he met Hiawatha. And Hiawatha, there's a big story behind that as well too. Again, I don't have the time to get into, but essentially, Hiawatha was very accepting of this message of peace, and he then traveled with the Peacemaker, and Hiawatha actually served as the spokesperson as they traveled throughout the 5 nations to spread this message of peace. Jugunsase, too, she would also be very instrumental in accompanying them to bring this message of peace to the 5 nations, specifically to the Seneca Nation, because she was a Seneca woman herself. So after, the Mohawks had accepted this message of peace, they then traveled to the Oneidas. The Oneidas are sometimes referred to as the little brothers of the Mohawks. So whatever the Mohawks agreed to, the Oneidas were like, yeah, sure, certainly, if they're agreeable to that, then we'll be agreeable to accept this message of peace and accept this message of unity. Then they traveled over to the Cayugas, again, bringing the same message of peace, same message of unity. And the Cayugas accepted. And the Cayugas, they were kind of known as, the little brothers, if you will, of the Onondagas. And the Onondagas, they were pretty fierce, and they had one specific fierce, very feared warrior amongst them. So needless to say, as they're traveling through their journey, they got the Cayugas to agree to this peace message, and then they met the Senecas, which is the territory that in the Rochester vicinity, in the Rochester area, we are on Seneca territory. But because Tecumseh accompanied them, and she was one of the first ones to accept this message of peace, eventually the Senecas agreed to this. So now we have, these four nations that are agreeable to begin to form this alliance and accept this message of peace and unity. So they travel to the Onondagas, knowing that they have to meet with Tedadaho. And Tedadaho, he was the one that was, the fiercest. And he was a fierce warrior among the five nations, very feared. And it's been said, too, that he lived in the swamp. So if you can think of the Onondaga territory, Montezuma, what we refer to as Montezuma today, he was living within that vicinity. And, he was so fierce and so feared, that it was represented in his countenance, in his outward appearance. So it said he was almost unrecognizable. He had snakes in his hair, his body was crooked, and just, if you came upon him, which you didn't want to, he was almost unrecognizable. But perhaps the greatest travesty about Tedadaho, it had to be evil, right, to carry out these horrible atrocities during times of war amongst our five nations. And so at this point, like I said, the other nations had already agreed to accept the message of peace, and one by one, they formed the alliance that would eventually become the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And so the Peacemaker, Hiawatha, Tecumseh, and others that began to form this alliance and agree to step into, positions of council. There's different variations of the story, but what I have come to understand was that after approaching Tedadaho and either singing or perhaps reciting what would be recognizable as a poem to him, that was their approach to meet with him, because they knew, he was fierce. He wouldn't, be very agreeable and very accepting to this message of peace and unity. So as they sang or read, recited poems, it's been said that, again, it softened his heart. And then very shortly after, these three brave leaders, along with, these new members of this newly developing council, had approached Tedadaho, again, with the songs, the poems, sorry, I'm repeating myself. But as they did so, eventually they saw the snakes begin to fall out of his hair. And what was once a body was now standing upright. And the most important aspect of all was what was once a very evil and contrite heart was now becoming softened and was now beginning to heal, if you will. And so as they approached him with, this message of peace, with this message of unity, they also had approached him with the opportunity and the extension, knowing that his heart was now becoming changed and softened. They approached him with, as Tedadaho being the leader of all the nations. So as this council and as this alliance of all the nations was coming together, he would actually be the one that would have the final say, like the final stamp of approval, if you will, over everything. And so he agreed to be a part of that. And so then the Onondagas, were then the nation to form this alliance and agree to this message of peace and unity, and would now develop this Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So the Onondagas, they're known as the Central Fire Keepers, and when this alliance was forming, you know, a lot of these council meetings would happen on their territory. And Tedadaho, again, being the leader of the council, he and the Onondagas would get the Onondagas and he would get the final say on, you know, the happenings throughout the entire Confederacy. So where this new unity was, and this alliance and the formation of what would be the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, there was a new strength of purpose. And within this new strength of purpose, when they were formally gathering, and first formally gathering on Onondaga Lake, the Peacemaker brought them together, and he asked for one of their arrows. And so one of the nations gave the Peacemaker one of his arrows, and he was able to break it very easily in front of them. And then he asked every nation to give him one of their arrows, and he bundled them together. And as hard as he tried to, he couldn't break them. And so the symbolism of that is that you can see that now, as we're uniting together as one, and we're agreeing to come together in peace and unite, we can't break if we're united as one. And so as such, he then found a great white pine on Onondaga Lake as they were all meeting. And under this great white pine, he uprooted the pine and exposed the cavity. And so the Peacemaker had asked each nation to throw their weapons and to throw their arrows and their other weapons that they had formulated into this cavity, knowing that when the tree is uprighted and those things are planted, there are underwater currents that occur that would eventually sweep all of those weapons away forever. And they would certainly not be able to return to any form of war or any instance of war. So there's also too, under the great white pine, so he did that, right? Uprooted the tree, they buried all of their weapons, put the tree right back up. And there are 4 roots that represent the 4 directions. And these 4 roots are known as the 4 roots of peace. And so also symbolically, there is an eagle perched atop the great white pine, and the eagle is there purposely to alarm if there is any danger encroaching upon those 4 roots of peace. Because again, we're committing to and we're agreeing to all be in unity and fully commit to this peace agreement. And this is how we will live out, you know, the rest of the next 7 generations to come in, and way beyond that too. So there's a lot of symbolism there with the great white pine, with the 4 roots of peace, with the eagle, you know, that's perched atop the tree. And so this would come to symbolize peace for the Haudenosaunee. And so the Peacemaker, he brought the great law of peace. And so now, as we are, you know, solidly formed, we're solidly together as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Peacemaker had brought the great law of peace. And then those eventually, from what I understand from the versions that are told, would be our Constitution, if you will. And so as our nations came together, formed this confederacy, the great law of peace is what makes up, you know, our Constitution, what that dictates how we are to live our lives so that we can maintain this level of peace and this level of unity. There's actually a great law recital that happens every summer, and it's held on a different territory of the representative nations within the Confederacy. And it's to remind us, so whatever territory is hosting the Great Law Recital, it's done, it's recited in their language, and it's to remind us, and it's also to teach the next generations coming what it means to commit to this great law of peace, so that we can pass it down, you know, to the next generation. So significant in our unity and understanding too, that with this message of peace that the Peacemaker brought, we realized that our warring was futile. And instead, we could serve and live out a greater purpose if we actually came together in peace and unity And right, you really can't have peace and unity without having a form of reconciliation or a form of forgiveness. So we agree that whatever, you know, atrocities we carried out amongst one another, you know, that's all behind us. Those are buried. Those weapons are gone. And even, you know, the metaphoric weapons, if you will, too, of inciting fear and hatred and jealousy and all of those things, you know, as the physical weapons got buried under the great white pine, so did the metaphoric weapons as well, too, as we move forward as a united Confederacy committing to this message of peace that the Peacemaker brought us. So I share that, and then I'll also share a personal story in how I was able to recognize, you know, the parallels in different opportunities or different moments in my life where, unbeknownst to me, you know, I had made and chosen this pathway of forgiveness, how it so paralleled what our people had been about and are about, you know, for potentially millennia. So my story is about extending forgiveness to a family member. And with this family member, I wanted to hold them accountable for all of these infractions, if you will, that were committed that I chose to take offense to. And so I can say all this now. I couldn't say it then because I couldn't see it then, but when you're on that forgiveness journey, you know, if you allow your heart to be open, there's so much that you come to recognize and realize. So I wanted to hold this person accountable. You know, I wanted them to take ownership. And it's almost like when we do that, you know, when we approach someone, we want them to take accountability and ownership. It's seemingly for our own justification, right? Which is very self. It's very about self. And so I realized, wait a second, if I'm holding this person accountable and if I'm expecting them to take ownership, actually what I'm expecting them to take ownership of, no person could be accountable to that. Because essentially what I was expecting them to take ownership of in all of these infractions that I took offense to over the course of our life and our relationship, they were actually just manifestations of these intergenerational traumas that had been passed down from one generation to the next. I mean, even just with the story of my grandmother being a residential school survivor, thriver, I call her, you know, the atrocities that she suffered and that she endured, and the atrocities that all of our ancestors prior to that had endured and suffered, they manifest into the form of intergenerational trauma. And so what I realized was I was expecting this person to not be accountable just for the infractions that they had, you know, committed against me in our relationship, but I was actually expecting them to shoulder and to burden all of the atrocities from all of our ancestors before, because really what manifested into what I became offended towards was just a manifestation of all of that intergenerational trauma finally trickling down to between myself and this person. And so in a moment, I recognized, wait a second, that's so unfair. I can't expect this one individual to burden and carry all of the atrocities and sufferings from our previous ancestors. And what I realized was, well, if I turn this way and I expect them to be accountable, I would just be seeking my own justification, my own self-centered justification. But if in fact I actually pivot and I switch and I turn to embracing and encompassing forgiveness instead of accountability, that in a moment that could forever shift this long lineage of intergenerational traumas that had been passed down. And I had a unique opportunity to, all right, again, if one way I hold you accountable, like it's just going to continue. But instead, if I pivot and I actually embrace forgiveness and extend forgiveness for this individual, it's also extending forgiveness to all of the atrocities that happened that created the intergenerational traumas. And I could forever possibly change what it will mean and what it will be for our particular lineage for the next 7 generations to come. And to me, that was so life transforming. And to me, I recognized, yes, that is the path I want to take, because those resilient fibers of fierceness and strength that my grandmother embodied, those fibers could now exist in my daughter and the next 7 generations to come, because forgiveness created a pathway for that. Forgiveness created an allowability for that to continue on. And forgiveness created that intersection of stopping the intergenerational trauma that had continued to be passed down. So that was, I mean, really, I can't even, put into enough adjectives how, and expressions of how life transforming that was. And so, I'm happy to be able to live that out and walk that out on a daily basis. And so another story is, how are we doing on time here? All right, another story, I have to wrap up kind of quickly here because I want to leave a few minutes for Q&A. So because this is a Rochester, summit to end hate, being in these brave spaces, I recently had an opportunity to attend a town hall meeting. It was virtual. And I guess recently meaning, it was kind of in response to, what the atrocity that had happened with George Floyd. And so I'm attending this town hall meeting that was put on by, how can I say it, like of a representative or an extension of government, if you will, that was holding this town hall meeting. And so nonetheless, it was a place for an opportunity for them to express, how they were responding to this situation and how important it is for our community, within this town hall meeting to come together and how do we move forward. It was also an opportunity to provide a platform for people to express how they were feeling and, just kind of be support for one another. So anyway, in the beginning of this town hall meeting, the upper level of administration that was representative in this town hall meeting, and I heard it repetitively. It wasn't just from one of those upper level administrative representatives. What I kept hearing was, well, we have to change laws. Like, laws have to change in order for any of this, to take on a new form and to take on and create change. And I kept hearing this repeated. And I'm sitting there, I was just perplexed. Because yes, while I recognize change does need to happen, and in that fashion, to me, what was so tangible was that this is a heart issue. When we're talking about issues of racism, this is largely a matter of the heart, and no amount of regulation and legislation and mandating can ever transform and create a shift within the heart. And so I thought, well, gosh, we could change legislation, until we turn blue, but is that really going to intersect and change what matters the most, which is our own individual hearts? I feel like if our heart is transformed and changed first, then that can impact perhaps legislation and regulatories and mandates. But that shift needs to happen individually first. Because again, it is a matter of the heart. Like government, entities that embody, change in the form of legislation and mandating, it's an entity, like it's devoid of heart. And so I remember just sitting in this meeting perplexed, like, gosh, this is a matter and an issue of the heart. So we have to evaluate our own hearts. And I'm sure most of you who have agreed to, come to this summit on a Sunday afternoon, maybe you're quite aware of where your heart is at in this whole matter, in this whole aspect of racism. So I would implore you that if you have come to a place of perhaps reconciliation or forgiveness, and you can extend what you know as a good message, as perhaps a good-minded message of peace and unity and reconciliation, then that's where I would implore you to start first and begin talking to whoever, to your family members, to your mate, to your children, then to your coworkers, to your community, to your local representatives, that this is an issue and a matter of the heart. And so if you remember when I was talking about Tedadaho, his heart needed to be changed. His heart needed to be transformed before this entire confederacy could ever take shape and ever take form, and be united as one and fully embrace this message of peace and carry this out for the rest of our time. His heart needed to be transformed and changed first. And so that is, I guess, simply what I will leave you with, is, understanding and really examining our own hearts and understanding, where we can take our own message of peace to, and where we can exemplify even our own messages of peace along this troubled journey of racism. So, all right, we have a few minutes. I'll take any questions that you may have. I'll try and I don't know if you want to raise your hand, if I can see everyone. I don't know if my moderator is able to help me, but I'll do my best. If you have a question, you want to put it in the chat, I'll just kind of read it from there and go from there. If anyone has a question. Or I guess you can unmute yourself too, right? And just speak your question as well too. All right, Sue, yes, you raised your hand, go ahead.
Thank you. I put it in the chat, but I live in Pittsford Village, so it's Seneca territory. And I'm wondering if it would be possible to, as a collective, including you, Ganondagan, anyone from Haudenosaunee community that would be willing to initiate a peace and forgiveness process here. I don't believe we have anything in the United States. They do have it in Canada. So I'm wondering if we could be the ones to initiate this process here, and in honor of that great law of peace, to activate it again.
Yeah, I love all of that because I'm truly about forgiveness and all that, forgiveness path and a forgiveness journey encompasses. What Sue had mentioned, in Canada has a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so basically the Canadian government has implored their Canadian citizens with, I believe it's 94 points of what a Canadian citizen needs to familiarize themselves with to come to a place of reconciliation for their First Nations peoples. And so we largely, unfortunately, don't have anything like that active within our US government. So yeah, I mean, I'd be all about, a startup for that. That would be great. And there's also too, for those of you, let's see, if you want to get in contact with me after, I know there's an exercise that can be brought to organizations church groups, whomever, and it's called the Kairos Blanket Exercise. And actually, it was birthed out of Canada, and it was birthed out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But it goes through, an explanation of our 500-year history here, and it really, talks about the reality of the true forms of history of what happened, which most people are unfamiliar with. So. Let's see, any other questions? All right, what happened to the Peacemaker once the mission of unity was accomplished? Yeah, so like I had mentioned briefly, this Confederacy came together, and they came under the Great White Pine, had that. And then after that, they took his message of the Great Law of Peace and began to form our Constitution. And then, from what I understand of what's being told, or what is told, is that, the Peacemaker simply just disappeared or went away. His mission was accomplished. So, yeah. Let's see, any other, I'll do the best I can to see any hands raised, or if you want to type it in the chat, that would be great too. Okay, or yeah, just go ahead.
I was going to say, I would also love to know what we could take from this to use to transform the police situation, not only how we feel, but how we're dealing with the police. I actually have something that's relevant I'm actually working with some people in Seattle who also have to deal with some policing issues and the racial justice issues that have gone on, and actually specifically for Indigenous people as well as African Americans. But here, it just seems like everywhere in the nation, but here especially, it feels alive to how do we open up forgiveness as a way to deal with what's been going on with the police. So.
To that point, right? Weren't they peace officers first before needing to be police officers? So yeah, right? If we can trail that back to, some of the initial constructs of their intended purpose, yeah, that I can't agree more. That would be great to be able to return to that place. Okay, so another question, or if somebody else has, I'm sorry, I'm so cumbersome with this, right? We're learning in this whole new world of virtual. If someone else has a question, just go ahead and say it. It looks like there's another one here. I'll read quickly from the chat. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy taught as local history, like when I was in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. Yes. Largely it's 4th grade and 7th grade, and then I think again at 11th grade as well too. Yeah, if someone had a question, go ahead.
Yes. So I have a question. Is Tiffany, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering, is there anything in our area or anything nationally that kind of brings together the Black and Indigenous people of America, to work on these things? Because I feel like we are aligned in so many ways. Do you know of any groups?
I personally don't know of any formal alliances, but yeah, again, I can't agree more. There are so many parallels that we share as a people that it would just seemingly make sense, right, for us to form an allegiance in moving forward, this great message of peace that represents Indigenous and, represents the African American community here in this nation. But unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't have, a quick and hard answer that says, yes, go here and, search out this group that may exist, but I'm not off the top of my head familiar with anything.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, contact information. Sure. Yeah, if anyone else has question, let me see. All right, I can quickly.
I do have a question.
Sure.
I really agree with the heart being supreme, but sometimes the heart has to follow the law. Look at desegregation in the South. Those laws were passed, and hopefully the hearts followed after that.
It's true.
Because
Right.
the cruelty and inequity still goes on, and that has to be stopped, and hopefully hearts will follow. But sometimes they don't come first. And, how do you protect people until the heart happens?
Right,
And
right. That's true. That's true.
Ronnie, I
Mhm.
agree with what Hans was saying. This is Barb.
Oh, Barb. Hi.
Hi.
Mhm.
I think like Ibram Kendi's really advocating for policy change to change the racist structures. But I think some of the ways that there's not enough heart change, so then there's backlash against when structures try to get changed, like or when we pass new policies. So, and I even noticed in the story a little bit that the four nations were already trying to sort of set up a government and do some of the policy structure work as they went back to the leader of the Onondaga to change his heart. So I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, you really want to change hearts, but you have to do sort of both and. You know, you have to do some heart work,
Right.
internal heart work, interpersonal, and then also change the structures.
Right. Right. That's so true. And to Hans's point as well, too, that's true. I mean, because there were laws that existed in the South, that continued segregation and marginalization, and it kind of okayed it, it gave it the seal of approval. So yeah, that's why it's so important to because your heart could be involved, but where is that measure? Where's the metric? They think, well, yeah, I'm having a good heart and I'm having good intentions, but if they don't parallel what and embrace, some of the transforming that really needs to take place and really needs to take form in areas of racism in this country, right? I mean, we could be amiss again on all of it, because we certainly were, historically prior to the civil rights movement.
Yeah, like I hope that at that town hall someone asked, when they said laws need to be changed, someone said, well, so what are you going to do to change the laws in your town? And
right, yeah,
or to do the heart work to get to that place where people would want the changes.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I see, let's see, I put my contact information up there if anyone wants to reach out to me. Taj Smith had also shared, there's a grad student working on this at Syracuse University, unity between Indigenous and Black community. Yay! That's wonderful. So again, thank you so much, Nyawe Goa. Thank you so much for your time today on this Sunday afternoon, and more importantly, thank you for showing up with your hearts. That's the most important aspect in all of this. So I wish you all well. I wish you all peace. I wish you all unity, and especially forgiveness and reconciliation, that it is able to find your path.